The handcuffs clicked shut around Marcus Webb's wrists, while his hands still smelled like brake fluid. Two officers walked him past the lift bays of Coastal Auto Repair, past the tool chest his daughter had painted a small sunflower on when she was 7, past the customers pretending not to stare. Marcus didn't fight it. He didn't raise his voice. He just turned his head once, searching the waiting area, and found his daughter's school photo still taped inside his cracked locker door before the officer pulled him forward. In the corner of that waiting area, in a folding chair, no one had bothered to offer him anything better than sat an older man in a plain, gray jacket. He hadn't said a word since he walked in 2 hours earlier for what was supposed to be a simple oil change. He didn't say a word now either. He just watched. Watched the manager standing by the front desk with his arms crossed and a look on his face that didn't match a man who'd just caught a thief. Watched the way the young mechanic's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed level when he said, "I didn't touch that car. Check the cameras." Watched the manager glance, just for a half-second, toward the back office like he was checking whether someone else was watching too. The old man said nothing, but he noticed everything. If you've ever been blamed for something you didn't do and had to stand there and watch people believe the lie because it was easier than the truth, you already know how this story feels before it even starts. Stay with this one until the end. Because the quiet man in that folding chair was not just some customer waiting on an oil change, and in 10 days he was going to walk back through that same front door, and nothing in that shop was going to be the same again. 3 weeks earlier, Marcus Webb's mornings all looked the same. He woke at 5:40, made 2 lunches instead of 1, and stood at the small kitchen counter of his apartment, checking his daughter's backpack for her inhaler before she left for school. Their apartment wasn't much. 2 bedrooms, a window unit that struggled in August, a corkboard covered in her drawings held up with mismatched pins. But it was clean, and it was theirs, and every bill was paid on time because Marcus made sure of it. His daughter, Ellie, was 11. She liked drawing cars more than dolls, which Marcus secretly loved more than he'd ever admit out loud. She'd sit at the kitchen table, sketching engines she didn't fully understand yet, asking him questions about torque and pistons that most adults wouldn't bother asking. "Why do some cars sound different when they start?" she asked one morning, spooning cereal. "Different engines, different number of cylinders, different age," Marcus said. "Like people. Everybody's got their own sound, if you listen close enough." She grinned at that, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Marcus had learned a long time ago that the way you talk to a kid mattered more than most people gave it credit for. You didn't dumb things down. You just explained them clearly. At Coastal Auto Repair, Marcus was the best technician on the floor, and everyone there knew it, even the people who wouldn't say it to his face. He'd been there 6 years. He diagnosed problems other mechanics missed. He didn't guess. He tested, checked twice, and only spoke when he had something worth saying. Customers who came in confused and anxious left understanding exactly what was wrong with their car and exactly what it would cost, because Marcus believed people deserved that. The shop manager, a man named Dale Prescott, did not share that belief. Dale had been installed as manager 8 months earlier, brought in from a corporate office 2 states away, after Coastal Auto Repair got folded into a larger regional chain called Ridgeline Automotive Group. Dale wore a tie in a shop where nobody else did. He talked in numbers, labor, hours billed, upsell percentages, customer retention metrics, and he talked about them the way some men talk about sports scores, like the shop existed purely to produce them. Better than fine. But Marcus refused to pad estimates, refused to recommend services that weren't needed, and twice in the past 2 months had corrected a quote Dale tried to push through that would have overcharged a customer for parts that didn't need replacing. Dale did not forget things like that. "You're costing us margin, Webb," Dale had told him once, standing too close to the workbench, arms crossed. "Corporate wants 70 on parts markup. You're running us at 40 because you keep telling grandmothers their brake pads have another 6 months in them." "They do have another 6 months in them," Marcus said. "I checked the wear. Nobody's checking your checking. They should." Dale hadn't liked that answer. Marcus hadn't expected him to. What Marcus didn't know yet What nobody on the shop floor knew was that Ridgeline Automotive Group wasn't just some regional chain answering to a distant board. It had recently been acquired, quietly through a holding company most employees had never heard of, by a much larger parent corporation. And the man who owned that parent corporation, a man named Arthur Kessler, had a habit that made his executives nervous. He liked to visit his own businesses without announcing it. Arthur Kessler was 71 years old, built half his fortune from a single transmission parts company he'd started in his 20s, and had spent the better part of the last decade quietly buying up automotive service chains across the country. He didn't do it for the money. He had more money than he could spend in 3 lifetimes. He did it because he believed, in a way his own board found almost embarrassingly old-fashioned, that a car shop was where trust either got built or got destroyed, one customer at a time, and he wanted to know which one was happening in the places that carried his name. Taz. He never announced these visits. He dressed like nobody. He sat, he watched, and he left. Most of the time, nobody in the shop ever learned who he was. That was the plan. On the day he walked into Coastal Auto Repair, for an oil change on a car nobody would have looked at twice. He arrived a little after 10 in the morning, signed in at the front desk under the name printed on his driver's license, which was not a name anyone in that shop recognized, and took a seat in the waiting area with a folded newspaper he didn't really intend to read. He watched Marcus work through the front window that looked out onto the bay floor. He watched the way Marcus moved, economical, unhurried, checking something twice before he committed to a diagnosis on the car he had up on the lift. He watched him crouch by a rear wheel well, run a gloved finger along a brake line, frown slightly, and walk over to explain something to the car's owner, with a level of patience Arthur hadn't seen from a mechanic in longer than he could remember. Arthur made a note of that, not on paper, in the part of his memory reserved for things worth remembering. Then, around noon, the tone in the shop shifted. A customer named Rosalind Chu had come in 3 days earlier to have a check engine light diagnosed on her sedan. Marcus had handled the intake, run the diagnostic, and found a faulty oxygen sensor, a straightforward and inexpensive fix. He'd written it up, gotten her approval, ordered the part, and installed it. The following day, the car had been sitting in the lot since, waiting for her to pick it up after work. When Rosalind arrived that afternoon, she didn't come in smiling. She came in holding her phone, scrolling to a text message saying that $400 had gone missing from an envelope she said she'd left in her glove box, cash for a wedding gift for her sister. She said she remembered it being there when she dropped the car off. She said it wasn't there now. Dale was at the front desk within 30 seconds of hearing the word missing, who had access to that vehicle. Dale asked, loud enough for the whole waiting area to hear, loud enough that Arthur, still sitting quietly with his unread newspaper, looked up. The service coordinator, a young woman named Priya, checked the work log. Marcus had it for the sensor replacement. That's it, nobody else touched it. Dale's expression did something Arthur caught and filed away immediately. It wasn't surprise. It was closer to relief, quickly buried under a mask of concern. "Get him up here," Dale said. Marcus came up from the bay, wiping his hands on a rag, still not fully aware of what was happening, and by the time he understood the accusation being laid at his feet, Dale had already picked up the phone and called the police loudly, performatively, in front of the waiting customers, saying words like theft and breach of trust before anyone had asked Marcus a single question. "I never opened that glove box," Marcus said. His voice didn't rise. "I didn't need to. The sensor's under the hood." "The car was in your bay for over 24 hours, Dale said. "Plenty of time. Check the cameras," Marcus said again. "There's one over bay 3. It'll show exactly what I touched and what I didn't." Dale's eyes flicked. Again, toward the back office. Arthur saw it a second time. He didn't yet know what it meant. But he had built a career on noticing the space between what people said and what their bodies did while they said it, and something in that glance did not sit right. "Cameras in this location have been down for repair," Dale said smoothly. "Corporate's aware. It's in the maintenance ticket." Arthur knew from the acquisition paperwork alone that Ridgeline had approved a camera system upgrade for every location 8 weeks earlier. He said nothing. He watched. The police arrived 11 minutes later. They were polite, procedural, unhurried in the way officers are when a scene has already been narrated for them before they arrive. Dale met them at the door and walked them through the story in a tone that sounded rehearsed even the first time through. Rosalind, visibly upset, corroborated the timeline she'd been handed. Marcus stood by the service counter, with his arms loose at his sides, not resisting, not raising his voice, answering every question he was asked with the same flat, factual calm. Do you deny having access to the vehicle? No. I had access to perform the repair I was assigned under the hood. Do you deny being alone with the vehicle? I was alone with it, the way every mechanic is alone, with every car they work on. That's the job. It didn't matter. The story had already been written before the questions started, and Marcus watched it play out with the particular exhausted clarity of a man who has learned that the truth doesn't always win the room it's spoken in. When the cuffs went on, he asked for one thing only. Can somebody call my daughter's school? She gets out at 3:15. Someone needs to be there. Nobody answered him directly. Priya, white-faced behind the counter, nodded quickly, and Marcus held onto that nod as the officers walked him out through the waiting area, past the folding chairs, past the old man in the gray jacket, who had still not said a single word. Arthur watched the door close. Then he stood, folded his newspaper under his arm, and walked to the front desk. I'd like a copy of my service invoice, he said to Priya, whose hands were still shaking slightly. And I'd like the name of the technician who was assigned to my vehicle today. That was Marcus, too, she said, before catching herself, as if saying his name out loud right then felt dangerous. He did your oil change this morning. Arthur nodded slowly. Thank you. He left without another word, but he did not go home. He drove 4 blocks, parked outside a public library, and sat in his car for the better part of 40 minutes, making calls from a phone number that only 3 people in his entire company had ever seen. He called his head of corporate security, a woman named Denise Okafor, whom he trusted with the kind of matters that could not survive a leak. He gave her one instruction. I want every camera log, every maintenance ticket, every work order from that location for the last 6 months. I want it quietly, and I want it by tomorrow morning. Yes, sir. Can I ask what this is about? A mechanic, Arthur said. And the man who had him arrested for something, I don't think he did. Denise didn't ask a second question. She'd worked for Arthur Kessler for 9 years, and she'd learned that when his voice dropped into that particular register, quiet and unhurried, it meant he had already decided something, and the facts were simply catching up to the decision. Marcus spent one night in a holding cell before a public defender, got the charges reduced to a pending investigation, and secured his release on the condition he not return to Coastal Auto Repair pending the outcome. He walked out into the parking lot at 7 in the morning, into the arms of his neighbor, an older woman named Ruth, who had picked Ellie up from school the day before and kept her overnight without being asked twice. She kept asking if you did it, Ruth said quietly, handing him his phone and wallet from the manila envelope. I told her no. I told her you didn't. Thank you, Marcus said. His voice cracked slightly on the second word. The first crack Ruth had seen in him in the 3 years she'd known him. What are you going to do? Marcus looked at the gray morning sky for a long moment. My job, he said. I still know how to do that. Nobody can arrest me for that. He didn't have a job to go back to, not officially, not yet. Dale had already processed his termination the same afternoon he was arrested, citing breach of company policy and pending criminal investigation, language crafted by someone who understood exactly how thin a legal tightrope he was walking, and exactly how unlikely a suspended single father with a public defender was to walk it back. What Dale did not know was that somewhere in a server room 40 miles away, Denise Okafor was pulling 6 months of maintenance tickets and finding something that made her sit back slowly in her chair. The camera system at Coastal Auto Repair had never gone down for repair. Its uptime log showed continuous operation, uninterrupted, for the entire period in question, which meant somewhere footage existed, and someone had lied about it not existing. She found the footage, within the hour, buried in a backup archive Dale clearly hadn't known was mirrored automatically to corporate servers. A detail of the recent Ridgeline acquisition that had apparently never made it into the store-level training. The footage from Bay 3 showed exactly what Marcus had said it would show. Him, under the hood, replacing a sensor. Never once near the driver's side door, never once near the glove box. It also showed something else. Something Denise watched twice before she picked up the phone to call Arthur. At 6:52 the previous evening, long after Marcus had clocked out, the footage showed Dale Prescott walking into Bay 3 alone, opening the passenger door of Rosalind Chu's sedan, and leaning into the glove box for 11 seconds. Denise didn't need a law degree to know what she was looking at. She called Arthur immediately. "I have it," she said. "You need to see this yourself before we do anything with it." Arthur watched the footage that evening in his study. Twice, the second time slower than the first, the way he read important documents. Twice, once for the shape of the thing, and once for the details buried in the shape. He said nothing during either viewing. When it finished, he set his glass of water down on the coaster beside him and looked at Denise's face on the video call. "Where is he right now?" Arthur asked. "The mechanic, not Prescott. The other one? Unclear. Terminated yesterday. No forwarding address on file yet. Find him," Arthur said quietly. "I want to speak with him before anyone else touches this." It took Denise a day and a half. Marcus wasn't hiding. He had nowhere to hide to, and nothing left to hide with, but he also wasn't the kind of man who showed up in easy databases. He'd moved twice in 10 years, always paid rent in careful on-time installments, and the only address that led anywhere useful was the apartment where his daughter's drawings covered the corkboard. Arthur arrived there himself, unannounced, on a Thursday evening, wearing the same plain gray jacket he'd worn in the waiting room. He knocked twice. Marcus opened the door with the particular exhaustion of a man who has spent 36 hours mentally rehearsing a defense nobody had bothered to ask him for yet. He recognized the face immediately, the quiet man from the folding chair, and something in his posture stiffened, not with hostility, but with the wary caution of someone who has learned that people rarely show up at your door with good news. "Mr. Webb," Arthur said, "my name is Arthur Kessler. I think you deserve about 20 minutes of my time, and I think I owe you considerably more than that." Marcus studied him for a long moment. Behind him, in the small living room, Ellie sat cross-legged on the floor, sketching something in a notebook, glancing up curiously at the stranger in the doorway. "I don't have money for a lawyer," Marcus said flatly. "If this is about a settlement, you can talk to whoever the shop assigns." "I own the shop," Arthur said. "Not directly. Through about 4 layers of holding companies I'd honestly forgotten I owned until 3 days ago. But yes, I own it. And I was sitting in your waiting room the day they arrested you." Marcus didn't say anything for a moment. "You watched," Marcus said finally. It wasn't a question. It was closer to an accusation, though his voice stayed level. "I watched," Arthur agreed. "I didn't say anything because I didn't have enough yet to say anything useful. I have it now." He held out a plain manila folder. Marcus took it slowly, opened it, and found still images printed from the footage Denise had pulled. Dale Prescott, the glove box, the timestamp, 6:52 p.m., hours after Marcus had clocked out and gone home. Marcus read the timestamp 3 times before he spoke again. "He set me up," Marcus said quietly, not surprised, just confirming a shape he'd already suspected but hadn't let himself fully believe, because believing it changed nothing about the cuffs, or the cell, or the look on his daughter's face when Ruth had to explain where he was. "He set you up," Arthur confirmed, took the cash himself, staged the discovery with the customer, and used the arrest to get rid of a mechanic who kept correcting his margins in front of customers. "I'd guess he saw an opportunity and an excuse arrive on the same afternoon, and decided not to waste either." "Why come here?" Marcus asked. "You could have just fixed it through corporate, cleared my name with a phone call." Arthur considered that question with the seriousness it deserved. "Because I wanted to see how you'd respond when someone finally told you the truth," he said. "Some men would already be halfway through planning a lawsuit. You're just standing there processing it like a diagnostic report. I find that useful information about a person." Marcus looked down at Ellie, who had stopped drawing and was watching the 2 men with the frank, unguarded attention children have before they learn to hide it. "I'm not interested in being useful information," Marcus said. "I'm interested in getting my job back and making sure my daughter doesn't grow up thinking her father's a thief." "Fair," Arthur said. "Give me 10 days! 10 days!" Marcus repeated. 10 days! Arthur said again. "I'm not going to fix this quietly. I'm going to fix it in the same room he tried to destroy you in. That takes a little time to set up properly. I'd like your patience for it." Marcus studied him a long moment, the way he studied an engine that wasn't behaving, the way the manual said it should, carefully, without assumption, looking for the thing that didn't quite add up. End of 4. "Why not just fire him and move on?" Marcus said. "Why the room?" "Because men like Dale Prescott don't actually believe they'll ever face consequences," Arthur said. "They've built entire careers on that belief. I want him to be wrong about it in front of every single person who watched him be right about it for years." There was something in the way he said it, flat and unhurried, that reminded Marcus oddly of himself. He nodded once. 10 days. Those 10 days moved differently for the two men involved. For Dale Prescott, they moved with the particular smugness of a man who believed he'd successfully closed a loose end. He told colleagues at other Ridgeline locations that Coastal had cleaned house of a problem employee. He put in a requisition for a new hire at a lower hourly rate than Marcus had been earning, a detail he mentioned to his district supervisor with visible satisfaction. He did not know that his district supervisor now reported, through channels he didn't fully understand, directly to a security office that had spent the last week quietly building a file with his name at the top of it. For Marcus, the 10 days moved slower and heavier. He filed for unemployment. He took a temporary shift at a friend's independent carriage across town, paid in cash, off the books, enough to cover groceries. He picked Ellie up from school every day at 3:15, himself standing at the gate early because he'd promised himself he would never again be the reason someone else had to explain his absence to her. "Are you in trouble?" she asked him on the 4th day walking home, backpack straps clutched in both small fists. "I was accused of something I didn't do," Marcus said. "That's different from being in trouble. Trouble means you did something wrong. I didn't, but people think you did. Some people did. That's changing." "How do you know?" Marcus thought about the folder Arthur had left with him, the printed stills sitting now in a drawer in his kitchen, the timestamp he'd read 3 times. "Because the truth doesn't need me to defend it forever," he said. "It just needs somebody to finally look." Ellie considered that with the seriousness she brought to most things. "Okay," she said, and slipped her hand into his the rest of the way home. And that was enough for both of them. On the 7th day, Denise Okafor finished compiling a report that went well beyond the glovebox footage. Once she'd started pulling threads on Dale Prescott, more came loose than anyone expected. Falsified upsell reports, padding labor hours on elderly customers, a pattern of blaming inventory shrinkage on rotating junior technicians who left the company within months, never staying long enough to challenge the story attached to their exit. A separate, smaller theft 2 years earlier at a different Ridgeline location that had been quietly settled with a non-disclosure agreement instead of a police report, because at the time, firing Dale would have meant admitting corporate had missed the first set of warning signs. Arthur read that second report the way he read the first, twice. "How did we miss this the first time?" he asked Denise, not really expecting an answer. "Because nobody was looking for it," she said. "He was profitable on paper." Nobody audits profitable." Arthur sat with that for a long moment. It was, he understood, the exact rot he'd built his second career. Trying to root out the quiet arithmetic that let a company call a man successful right up until the day someone finally checked his math. "Schedule the regional meeting," he said. "All location managers, corporate leadership. I want Prescott presenting his quarterly numbers like nothing's wrong. And Marcus, invite him," Arthur said, "as my guest. Tell him to wear whatever he'd wear to a normal Tuesday. I don't want him dressed up for this. I want him exactly as he is." The regional meeting was held on the 10th day. In a conference room on the 14th floor of Ridgeline's corporate offices, glass walls overlooking a parking lot full of company vehicles, Dale Prescott had never once had to personally justify the cost of. Dale arrived early, Confident, a slide deck loaded onto the room's display, showing Coastal Auto Repair's quarterly performance in the kind of optimistic color scheme that made declining numbers look like plateaus. He'd rehearsed a line about resolving a personnel issue that had been quietly dragging down morale, a line he intended to deliver with the practiced modesty of a man who didn't want credit but would clearly accept it anyway. He noticed Arthur Kessler enter the room a few minutes before the meeting started and didn't recognize him. Nobody at Coastal had ever been told who the quiet man in the folding chair really was. Dale gave him a polite, distracted nod, the kind you give an unfamiliar face in a room full of people who matter, and returned his attention to his slides. He noticed Marcus Webb walk in 3 minutes later, wearing a plain button shirt with a small grease stain still faintly visible near the cuff, and his expression flickered just for a second before he schooled it back into professional neutrality. "Didn't expect to see you here," Dale said quietly, as Marcus took a seat near the back. "Didn't expect to be invited," Marcus said, "but here I am." Dale's presentation began on schedule. He walked through revenue figures, customer retention percentages, cost-cutting measures he claimed credit for, and arrived eventually at a slide titled Personnel Efficiency, where he described in vague corporate language the resolution of a trust and integrity matter at the Coastal location. Matter. He assured the room had been handled swiftly and appropriately, in full cooperation with law enforcement. "We take these situations seriously," Dale said, looking briefly, pointedly toward the back of the room where Marcus sat, without expression. "Theft, regardless of tenure or performance history, cannot be tolerated. I think the swift action here reflects well on how seriously this district takes accountability." It was, Arthur thought, watching from the head of the table a genuinely impressive performance, confident, fluent, utterly, completely hollow. "Pie." "Thank you, Dale," Arthur said, once the slide had finished and the room had offered its polite, obligatory nods. "Before we move to the next presentation, I'd like to show everyone something. It won't take long." End of. He nodded to Denise, who dimmed the lights and pulled up a video file on the main display. The room watched, in silence, as the footage from Bay 3 played. Marcus, under the hood, hours before the alleged theft. Then the timestamp jump. Then Dale Prescott alone, opening the passenger door, leaning into the glove box for 11 seconds. Nobody in the room spoke. Dale's face went through several stages in the space of about 4 seconds. Confusion, recognition, and then a scramble for footing that never quite arrived. That footage is out of context," he said. "I was checking the vehicle for a separate. The camera system was reported to corporate as non-operational on the date of the alleged theft," Arthur said, his voice even unhurried, the same tone he'd used in Marcus's doorway. "That report was filed by you personally. It was false. The system logs show continuous operation. I have those logs. I also have 3 additional files, Dale, that I'd like this room to see regarding inventory reports at 2 other locations under your management." He nodded to Denise again. The next document appeared on screen. The settlement agreement from 2 years earlier, the one that had quietly resolved an earlier theft with a signature and a confidentiality clause instead of a police report. "I'd like everyone in this room to notice the signature at the bottom of that agreement," Arthur said. "It's yours, Dale. You signed a legal acknowledgement of responsibility for theft at a Ridgeline location 2 years ago, and this company kept you employed anyway, promoted you, in fact, because you were profitable on paper. Nobody checked the paper. That mistake belongs to this company, and I intend to fix it. But what happened to Marcus Webb 10 days ago does not belong to this company. It belongs entirely to you." Dale opened his mouth. Nothing useful came out of it. "I didn't. The customer came forward. I responded to the situation as, you called the police before you asked him a single question," Arthur said. "You told them the cameras were down when you knew they weren't. You terminated him within hours, before any investigation had concluded, in a manner that ensured he had no access to evidence that would have cleared him immediately. That isn't a manager responding to a theft, Dale. That's a manager committing one and making sure someone else took the fall for it." The room was utterly silent now. A few of the other location managers had shifted their chairs slightly away from Dale's, an instinctive, almost animal recognition of a man who had just become radioactive. Dale looked briefly toward Marcus, sitting quietly at the back of the room, unmoved, unsmiling, simply watching the way he'd watched everything for the last 10 days. There was no triumph on his face, just a kind of settled, exhausted clarity. "I want to say something," Marcus said, and the room turned toward him. He stood slowly, hands loose at his sides, the same posture he'd held while being handcuffed 10 days earlier. "I've been fixing cars for 15 years, he said. "I've told customers things they didn't want to hear because it was true, and I've eaten the cost of that more than once, when it would have been easier to just tell them what they wanted and pad the bill. I did that because when you hand somebody their keys back, you want to be able to look them in the eye. That's the whole job, underneath the wrenches. Looking people in the eye." He glanced once at Dale. "You had me arrested in front of my own shop because it was convenient, because I corrected your numbers one too many times, and you needed a reason to get rid of me that didn't have your name attached to it. My daughter had to spend a night not knowing where her father was. That's the cost of what you did. Not a settlement. Not a bad quarter. That." He sat back down. Nobody in the room said anything for several seconds. "Dale," Arthur said finally, "you're terminated. Effective immediately. Security will escort you from the building. Legal will be in touch regarding the falsified reports and the prior settlement. I'd strongly advise cooperating fully." 2 security officers who had apparently been waiting outside the conference room the entire time entered and stood by the door. Dale stood slowly, gathered nothing, said nothing, and walked out under the same kind of silent escort he'd once arranged for someone else. The door closed behind him. Arthur turned to the rest of the room. "I'm auditing every location in this district personally over the next quarter," he said. "Anyone whose numbers depend on the kind of math Dale Prescott was doing should use this time to fix that voluntarily. I would much rather find these problems through cooperation than discovery." The meeting ended shortly after, in the strange, deflated quiet that follows any public unraveling. People filed out, murmuring, careful not to look too directly at each other, the way people avoid eye contact after witnessing something they don't yet know how to talk about. Marcus stayed in his seat until the room emptied. Arthur walked over and sat in the chair beside him, the two of them looking out at nothing in particular through the glass wall. "Your job's yours if you want it," Arthur said. "Full clearance, full back pay for the time you were out. And frankly, I think Coastal could use you running the floor, not just the bay." "I don't want to manage people," Marcus said. "I've watched what managing people does to people. I want to fix cars and go home to my daughter." "Then that's what you'll do," Arthur said. "But I'd like to offer you something else alongside it, if you'll hear it." Marcus waited. "I want to build a position," Arthur said. "Independent technical auditor reporting directly to me, not to any regional office. You'd visit locations across the company, unannounced, the way I do, except you'd actually know what you're looking at under the hood, which is more than I can say for myself most days. You'd have full authority to flag anything you find, and full protection from anyone trying to bury it. I think what happened to you happened because nobody in that shop had anyone they could report the truth to, without risking exactly what you went through. I'd like to fix that. I think you're the only person I've met in a long time who'd actually do the job the way it's supposed to be done, instead of the way that's convenient." Marcus considered this for a long moment. The same unhurried, methodical consideration he gave a diagnostic that didn't immediately point to an obvious answer. "2 conditions," he said finally. "Name them." "I keep my hours flexible enough to pick my daughter up from school every day. That's not negotiable ever, for any reason." "Agreed." "And I want the authority to shut down any location on the spot if I find something dangerous, not flag it." "Not recommended. Shut it down." Arthur almost smiled at that. The first real shift in his expression Marcus had seen since the folding chair in the waiting room. "Agreed," he said. "I was hoping you'd ask for that one." They shook hands there, in the empty conference room, glass walls, empty chairs, the faint hum of the building settling around them, and it was, for both of them, a quieter conclusion than either might once have expected from a story that started with handcuffs. 3 months later, Marcus stood in the bay of a ridgeline location 2 states away, crouched beside a lift, running his finger along a brake line the way he had 100 times before, while a nervous shop manager hovered nearby, trying to explain why a torque spec had been logged incorrectly on 4 separate work orders. "It's not about catching you," Marcus told him, standing, wiping his hands on a rag. "It's about making sure the next customer who sits in your waiting room gets the truth, whether it's good news or bad. That's the only thing I actually care about finding." The manager nodded, visibly relieved, and Marcus moved on to the next bay. That evening, back home, Ellie sat at the kitchen table with a new sketchbook. This one, a gift from Arthur, who had taken to visiting every few weeks, ostensibly for updates on the audit program. Though the conversations increasingly drifted toward things that had nothing to do with quarterly numbers. He sat now, across from her watching her sketch, the cutaway of an engine block, with more accuracy than most adults managed. "You've got the firing order wrong," he said gently, tapping the page. "I know," she said. "I'm still figuring out where number 3 goes. Ask your dad. He'll know. He always knows," she said. Matter of fact, the way children state truths. They've simply never had reason to doubt. Marcus, at the counter making coffee for 3 instead of the usual one, glanced over at the two of them with something unguarded on his face for just a moment, something that had nothing to do with brake lines or audits or conference rooms 14 floors up. Arthur caught the look and said nothing about it, filing it away the way he filed away most things worth remembering. Outside, the evening settled quietly over the small apartment, over the corkboard of drawings, over a life that had nearly been taken apart by a lie, and had instead, slowly and without much fanfare, been put back together by the simple, stubborn insistence on telling the truth. Marcus poured the coffee, set 2 cups on the table, and pulled up a chair beside his daughter, correcting, gently, the placement of cylinder number 3. Some things, he'd learned, didn't need to be argued for. They just needed someone to finally sit down, look closely, and get it right.